This is PTV World. I am SHABAHAT and you're watching Fault Lines. The war between Russia and Ukraine is getting increasingly difficult and dangerous. It has become dangerous because things have started tilting in favor of Ukraine immensely. And this is because of the increasing role of US intelligence and the increasing efficiency of the smart missile system provided to Ukraine, which is not only outmaneuvering the Russian army, but also outsmarting the Russian air defense. Now, this has created many holes in Russian defense, and in order to fill these gaps, Russia has started drafting people into military. They're getting less time to be trained, and as a result of which, not only protests have broken out in several parts of Russia, but also the injuries and the death rate have also increased. There are a lot of concerns with regards to this war, because if Russia keeps losing this war, we are facing another huge challenge. And the challenge is that Russia is a country that sits on the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. Do we expect Russia to lose the war while sitting on the largest nuclear stockpile? To answer this and many other questions, my first guest in the program is Mohammad Taimur, who is a research associate at Institute of Strategic Studies and frequently appears in my show. Taimur, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Taimur, the strategy of this war is changing direly. From Ukraine's perspective, Ukraine has started hitting the exact spots where it will hit Russia the hardest. They have started creating holes in the Russian defense system. And Russia, in return, has started hitting the population at large. Don't you believe this is a very dangerous escalation?
Well, the situation is getting very alarming, to be honest, because you have to realize that Russian political and especially its military leadership was facing a lot of criticism and pressure from its public and President Vladimir Putin for making slow progress in their invasion of Ukraine as of September. And they were also facing a lot of setbacks in the wake of the efficient Ukrainian counteroffensive that it had launched in early last month. So Russia had to prove itself, and plus the Western media was also stating that Russia's stockpiles are running dry and its military capability is waning away as well. So Russia had a point to prove, and these military installations, strategic installations that were targeted throughout Ukraine by Russian missiles, 85 to be exact, while quoting the Ukrainian sources, Russia had a point to prove, and that is why a massive retaliation that Russia carried out against Ukrainian major cities like Lviv, Dnipro, and Kiev is a testament of the fact that even the Russians were getting desperate and they had a point to prove, and that's what they did, and they decided to escalate the war situation in Ukraine.
Taimur, if I understood your point of view correctly, you're saying that Russia is trying to increase the cost of war too much for Ukraine. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that is absolutely true. Apart from increasing the cost of this war for Ukraine, the Russian attacks, the massive retaliation that Russia has launched against the Ukrainian territory is also a testament of the fact that the Russian leadership wants the Ukrainian population to realize that they need to persuade their leadership to give in to the Russian demands as soon as possible, because the longer this conflict persists, the costlier it will get for the Ukrainian population itself.
Taimur, I was seeing in one of his studies that says that not only Russia, but it's also NATO countries that are running out of ammunition. And if that is the fact, if this is what the situation is, then maybe very soon we are going to run out of weapons in this region, which perhaps might bring nuclear war as the only option left for the Russian side. So isn't this increasing the risk of a nuclear war way too much?
Of course. If you remember, in our last conversation, I categorically mentioned that the Western partners of Ukraine are about to experience the initial phases of aid fatigue, be it the financial aid as well as the military aid. You should keep in mind that all these military assistance that the European countries plus the Americans that they are handing out to the Ukrainian military are being taken from the existing stockpiles of their own private or their national inventories, and they are running dry because the conflict has persisted for more than 7.5 months, and it is about to enter its 8 months, and there is no end in sight to the hostilities of this war. So these countries are also thinking that they just might be in the long haul for this, and now they seriously will have to recalibrate their own strategies and keep their own needs and their own stockpiles in mind as well. That is why, and this is what Russian leadership is actually counting on, for these Western partners of Ukraine to experience their aid fatigue, as well as for the winter to set in, so that even their own local populations become desperate given the energy and food crisis that is persisting because of this war.
Tamur, Russia has a history of using winters to its own credit, to its own benefit. Now, we have seen that Russian forces have started hitting the power plants and the electricity's infrastructure in Ukraine. Is it a way to increase the agony for the Ukrainians in the harsh winters that are knocking at the doors of the region now?
Yes, it is one of the facets of the Russian strategy, in my humble opinion, because as mentioned earlier, Russia is trying to increase the cost of this war for the Ukrainian population. President Putin, in his last televised message to the nation right after the missile strikes that it carried out against Ukraine a couple of days ago, categorically stated that energy, military, as well as communications infrastructure were targeted by long-range, precise military missile strikes by Russia inside Ukraine. And the Ukrainian authorities have also stated that 11 major infrastructures, mostly related to energy infrastructure, were targeted in 8 different regions of Ukraine. So yes, Russia is trying to target and increase the cost of those, increase the cost for the Ukrainian population, such as right after the missile strikes were carried out, there were massive cuts of utilities such as water, electricity, and gas throughout different major cities in the Ukrainian landmass. And because of that, the military didn't suffer as much, but the population of Ukraine massively suffered, apart from the human casualties that resulted because of these missile strikes.
And Tamur, we just heard a very irresponsible statement by President of the United States. He said a nuclear Armageddon is knocking at our doors, which was then clarified by White House. But how serious of a statement it was?
Well, realistically speaking, as far as President Biden's statement of the nuclear Armageddon is concerned, I think that's that is once again his apocalyptic prediction about the war in Ukraine. I'm not completely ruling out the use of tactical nuclear weapons in this war because, as mentioned by President Putin himself, that he is going to use any and all measures available at his disposal to defend the Russian sovereignty as well as Russian land, which also includes nuclear weapons, but most importantly, tactical nuclear weapons, not strategic nuclear weapons. And on the other hand, I, would like to say that President Biden did make a slip of tongue, or he might be just trying to exaggerate the threat perception a little more, because in his own statements earlier this month, he stated that the U.S. intelligence doesn't have any proof that any on-ground mobilization of tactical nuclear weapons have taken place by Russia. So there's no threat of tactical nuclear weapons or any sort of nuclear weapons being used by Russia against Ukraine. So yes, the threat is still there because there is a threat of expansion of this war to other theaters and other countries in the region as well, most particularly Belarus, because the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, a couple of days ago, he stated that he has intelligence reports that Ukraine is planning on carrying out attacks against Belarusian territory and Belarusian military personnel as well. Apart from that, President Putin also said that 3 missile strikes were carried out by Ukrainian military against, a nuclear power plant inside the Russian territory, and there were also plans by the Ukrainian military to target the Turk Stream gas pipeline that is running under the Baltic Sea. So yes, if there is a chance of limited tactical nuclear warheads being used, if such strategic installations are targeted or the war expands to other theaters as well.
Taimur, from a distance, how would China be viewing this situation? Because China also has a couple of problems around its neighborhood, and there are some problems that China believes will be point of concerns for United States as well. The way the entire NATO is fighting with Russia and Russia's military strategies are amply failing, how big of a concern would it be for China?
Well, I think China is, looking at all these events very carefully and, watching and scrutinizing these developments very cautiously at the moment. Because, it is an open secret that in the National Security Strategy 2017 of the United States of America, China has been declared one of the most biggest national security challenges to the United States of America. So China knows that after US and or the West in general, is free from dealing with Russia, China is going to be the next one in line, and that is going to be the major challenge that the Western powers, most particularly the United States of America, is going to tackle head on. So, and its strategies are also, already manifesting its themselves all around the Chinese mainland as well. One major example is the developments that happened in the Taiwan Strait in the earlier months. But China has also, been strategizing and moving and making developments on its own as well. The Belt and Road Initiative is one of those strategies that the China is using right now in order to cut through the encirclement that the United States and its partners are trying to tightly net around China. You see, it is looking out for small passages so that its economic collaboration with the rest of the world remains afloat. Its economy keeps on growing, and it maintains its engagement with other partners in the world as well. It is increasing its engagement with Central Asian countries. It is increasing its engagement, especially its economic and strategic engagement with Russia and its other South Asian partners, particularly Pakistan. It is also making massive investments inside of Africa and the South American continent. And it is also making overtures to countries like South Korea and Australia as well. And it has also reached different agreements and tried to resolve its issues with its southern neighbor India as well, with which it actually carries or conducts $150 billion plus of economic trade annually. So China is also, slowly and gradually working in its own strategies in order to counter those anti-China or China encirclement strategies of the United States of America as well.
Thank you very much, Mohammed Taimur, for being guest in our program.
Pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with the second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, there is another ongoing problem in some other part of the world that is not catching our attention, but the problem is seriously getting difficult with each passing tick of the clock. And this is the problem between Tigray and Ethiopia. Now, Tigray is not a different country. It's a part of Ethiopia, a region of Ethiopia, which is actually in a full-scale war against its own country. The irony is that Ethiopia is not alone in this effort, but its neighboring country, Eritrea, has also attacked the Tigray region. And as a consequence of which, Tigray is being blockaded from both the sides. Both the militaries are fighting against the Tigray people, which has catastrophically increased the humanitarian cost of this war. And just to give you a rough idea of how serious the situation is on the ground, let me quote this, that according to independent news agencies, since June 2021, no international media person has been allowed inside the Tigray region. Now, all of this is happening under control of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who has a Nobel Peace Prize on his credit. What exactly is happening with the people of Tigray? What exactly is the problem between the two areas, between the two parts of same country? We'll see an in-depth analysis by our experts, but first watch the package prepared by Team Faultlines before I bring my first guest to this part of my program.
Fighting has flared in northern Ethiopia last month, shattering a 5-month truce and reigniting the destructive civil war. Tigray is the world's unseen war, a sprawling conflict hidden behind government siege, and the secret efforts at peace have given way to raging combat that could quickly expand across the Horn of Africa, destabilizing the region. The conflict in Ethiopia is huge as 3 major armed forces, including 2 of Africa's largest armies, those of Ethiopia and of Eritrea, are battling on multiple fronts across a rugged region twice the size of Switzerland. At least 100 civilians have died and as many as 500,000 have fled their homes in recent weeks, according to the United Nations. The World Health Organization chief warned that there is a very narrow window now to prevent genocide in his home region of Tigray in northern Ethiopia. An African Union statement has called for an immediate, unconditional ceasefire and urged the resumption of humanitarian services. Months of discreet American diplomacy have failed to stop the fighting in northern Ethiopia. Now the civil war is plunging into its most alarming phase yet. The Ethiopian military has taken control of 3 towns from rebel forces in the war-torn northern Tigray region, according to government sources. Now hopes for peace lie with the surprise announcement by the African Union inviting both sides to talks in South Africa, but no date has been fixed yet for the meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just watched the package, and now, in order to talk more detail about it, I have invited 2 guests. Both are joining me from the United States on Skype. My first guest is Claude Gate-Pugh. He's expert of African affairs and frequently appears on my show. Claude, I welcome you to the show. And with him, I'm joined by Dr. Binyam Awash, assistant professor of sociology at State University in New York. And let me tell you that Dr. Awash is a Tigray by his origin. So I'm very grateful, Dr. Awash, for being guest in my program today. Claude, starting from you first. Now, as you're an expert of African region, and you have talked about many African problems in our programs, tell us, is it a problem that is quite localized in its nature, or is it part of a greater problem that Africa is facing at large?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it does help to understand that what is happening in Ethiopia. So this isn't my view on it. It's not a region that's actually fighting the government. It's a group that is from a certain region and is ethnic based that is actually staging a rebellion against the government. This isn't new. This is actually something that is widespread around the continent. We have seen this in various regions of the continent. In the Sahel, in Mali, for example, we saw it with the Tuaregs. There's the NRM in Uganda. You got the RPF in Rwanda. You have the AFDL in the Congo. And so it's widespread in so many parts of the continent, where groups, especially a lot of times when this happens, it's so if I can use the example of Uganda, the current president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, lost an election in 1981. And instead of following what happened in the election, he started a war. In a war, it was ethnic based. He ended up winning, and usually what happens, a lot of these groups they have outside support. So that's the other dynamic. It's not local tribes, as many would think. And it's also not a localized conflict. This is something global. There's the support of the West propped up the NRM in Uganda, the RPF in Rwanda, the AFDL in Congo. And today we also have it going on in Ethiopia, where Western support for TPLF is really propped them up and made them emboldened. And of course, the TPLF was in government for many years, prior to this conflict. Now that they're no longer controlling the government, they started a war a couple of years ago. That's a little bit of the summary and the general picture on the continent.
Coming to you, Dr. Awash, now, what exactly is the problem in this region? Out of what we have learned from the international media, the problem have only started from the election of 2020, which the people of Tigray have refused to accept. Do you believe this is the primary trigger of the conflict that we have in hand?
So I think the conflict itself should be understood from two different perspectives. The narrative that you'll hear, particularly in mainstream Western corporate media, that includes from BBC to CNN, etc., is a conflict that's erupted between two parties that are of equal status: the federal government of Ethiopia and the governing regional party, which is the TPLF of this regional state called Tigray. And that this conflict is instigated or just occurs at a particular moment, which is in November 4th or November 3, 2021. Who started it, how it was started is not really discussed within this narrative, nor is any sort of question such as why has the war started? What are the objectives of the war? What are the political questions that are being contested over? These questions are never addressed, nor is there a context that's provided. So that's one aspect. The second aspect to think about it is that it's defined as a civil war. Now, what's very interesting is that if you step back and actually look at it, it is similar to what's happened in Syria. And many of your viewers can remember that Syria was a multi-layered internationalized war in which various parties, including Western countries, were participating in an attempt to eliminate the Syrian state and taking sides within also a domestic conflict. So the actual situation, as we've seen it evolve now, we've had about 2 years now to make sense and to have evidence about what's really going on, is that this is an internationalized war in which what's happening in Ethiopia is very much analogous to what's happening in the Ukraine, in which you have a proxy war that is being conducted against a sovereign African state. And the question really is why? Why would there be a proxy war using a grouping, a political grouping that is part of the Ethiopian political fabric, the TPLF? Now, why would that be necessary? And I think it's an interesting question because it goes back to, let's say, the backgrounds or the context by which we can understand the conflict. And I would just kind of remind you that the TPLF, which is the movement now that is at war against the Ethiopian state, and its stated objectives is actually regime change, right? The stated objectives is to use military force in order to change a government, which is unconstitutional, obviously illegal. Now, it started off as a guerrilla movement in the northern region of Ethiopia. It came to power over 30 years ago and became actually the ruling party for about 27 to 30 years in the federal government structure. Now, while it was the ruling party, it established one of the most autocratic governments on the African continent. And in 2014, you had a massive social movement led by young people named Kero, Fano, are two examples of young people that were marching and in instigating civil disobedience throughout the entire country, including attacking economic infrastructure that was aligned to specific TPLF-owned commercial entities. And so this multi-year civil disobedience, pro-democracy movement resulted in the ending, in the ejection of the TPLF from the federal government. So they lost power. Now, when they lost power, the EPRDF party, ruling coalition at that time, appointed a young, upcoming politician who was part of the coalition, Abiy Ahmed, as the new leader of the party. And his mandate was very simple. It was to stabilize the country, to address some of the youth and social movements that had been outraged by the degree to which they were shut out, and their future was pretty much shut out during that period. And so it is during that time in which you had the TPLF begin to have a problem domestically. That's one aspect. Now, on an international level, as soon as this new caretaker government, so to speak, is going to be constituted on this mandate of reform led by Prime Minister now Abiy Ahmed. He engages in relatively substantial and important steps towards reform. So release of all political prisoners. Now, political prisoners were in jail by the dozen during the TPLF-dominated EPRDF, by the thousands. So all of them were given amnesty and released. All political opposition that fled the country because to be a political party and participate in politics was not allowed, were invited with no exceptions whatsoever, as long as they simply laid their arms and participated in the political process through peaceful mechanisms. You also had the rescinding of a ban on freedom of the press and assembly, right? And another important aspect now that takes us to regional dimensions. The Horn of Africa is a very important region when we look at the global sort of map. It is strategically located and important. And for that reason, chaos is in the benefit of some powers, but for the region.
Professor, let me take Claude back into the conversation. Claude, we're talking about TPLF. What do you believe is primarily the problem with TPLF? Why do you believe TPLF, given its size, given its small location, is so much active militarily and politically?
Seeing the attitude of the international community and mainstream media, I actually agree with the line of his line of argument because we've seen. So the Syria was one of the examples I was given. We also saw what happened in Libya. Libya, of course, was not a democratic country, but there was an internal conflict. There was war. And the international community, led by NATO and the US, took advantage of that conflict and went for regime change in Libya. And in supporting the regime change in Libya, they actually deployed troops to go and fight in Libya. In this case, which is not uncommon, as I said, on the continent, what he's described of the TPLF is something that's widespread in multiple places on the continent. After Libya, there was Mali. Same type of support for the Tuaregs was given by the West for regime change in Mali. That didn't happen, but it didn't succeed. And we're seeing the same thing happen so it succeeded in other parts of the continent, especially in Central Africa. Now with Ethiopia, there's Western support for the TPLF. You ask the question, why does the TPLF seem so emboldened? It's because they have the support of Western governments. It is a proxy war, as the professor argued. It is the West pushing for control of the Horn, control of Ethiopia, using the TPLF as their proxy. To wrap up this point, the TPLF has served, as many various governments have, like the Chad government, for example, in the Sahel and North Central Africa, and others. As I mentioned earlier, the Rwanda government and the Ugandan government are doing the same in Central Africa, in East Central Africa. What the TPLF was doing in the 27 to 30 years that they ruled the Ethiopia was basically serving the West. In fact, there were so many human rights abuses that normally are denounced by the West. But when the leader of the TPLF, the prime minister, the previous prime minister of Ethiopia died, Meles Zenawi, there was a glowing eulogy from one of the United States top diplomats, Ms. Susan Rice. While she was denouncing Libya and other places, she was praising the same dictator that actually basically was the leader of the TPLF for that many years. So the TPLF is emboldened because they have support. They have outside support. Had it been just the TPLF on its own.
Professor Abash, I'm coming back to you now. Tell me why Eritrea is involved in this conflict, because this is not an Eritrean conflict to begin with. And also tell me if TPLF as we have heard, as we have learned from international media, TPLF is in an extremely bad shape. They are asking the government for negotiations. Is that right?
So thank you. The TPLF is not necessarily a small group. Actually, it's very interesting. The war itself was exactly initiated on November 3, 2020. And prior to the war, November 3, 2020, the TPLF, remember, is a political organization. It has a very long history, over 40 years, well established. It also has a very direct connection to international actors, particularly Western actors. And it served as a very important, if you put it charitably, ally. If not, you would simply say a proxy force for quite a bit of time, both while it was a guerrilla force as well as a government inside of Ethiopia. But it's also an economic behemoth. One of the key reasons why there's mass uprising is because that the upper echelons of the Ethiopian economy were controlled by the TPLF and its affiliates. And so it had access to enormous amounts of wealth. Now, the reason why in November 3, 2020, the TPLF conducted a simultaneous operation on the same night, that Tuesday night, that attacked 200 different locations simultaneously, well organized, in order to take out 80% of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces military equipment, heavy equipment, modern equipment, and with that also a large chunk of the Ethiopian military. So essentially during the first phase of the war, the first few months, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces were about 40,000, 50,000 maximum. So it's very important to understand that aspect, that it has access to billions of dollars, some which were looted and stashed outside the country. And you have international financial institutions that are pointed to that. And it also had access to incredible levels of military hardware. And it was also training for the past 2 years during that reform process in the Sudan. It was training soldiers on TV in Tigray. There was constant demonstrations and showing of this military prowess, new units, new brigades that are being set up, and constant threat and warning to the federal government that if you don't give us what we want, then we will be able to destroy your state, right? So that's the context to kind of think about the TPLF and its capabilities. Now, the support from the West, as you know, states don't have permanent friends, they have permanent interests. And you know very well in current news today, for instance, there's an 8-decade relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia right now is on a receiving end of incredible threats and shaming by the US president, because they've decided to act on the basis of their national interest, right? Regarding oil cuts and making sure that at least it doesn't go below $80 a barrel. Otherwise, you'll have financial trouble within the kingdom. So that's just to give you an insight that the West is not doing a charitable job. It's following its own interest. And so in that regard, what's very interesting in terms of the Horn of Africa is how the new administration, the Ethiopia administration, engaged in something that was really interesting: peace building. It formally recognized Eritrea and its claims regarding border territories that were disputed but awarded to Eritrea. It declared friendship and no hostility. And secondarily, it created a tripartite alliance called a New Horn of Africa Vision, so that African conflicts can be resolved through mutual institutions, regional institutions. This was considered a huge threat. It was considered unacceptable. And that is one of the reasons why you have then an attempt to push back against the Abiy Ahmed government. With respect to Eritrea, you should remember that in the declaration essentially of war by the TPLF, so attacking the national military of Ethiopia, capturing soldiers, killing perhaps up to 4,000 soldiers in such brutal fashion, declaring that they were going to march onto Addis Ababa and change the government by force. They also started launching missiles to the Eritrean sovereign territory and declaring that they were going to actually march to Eritrea as well. So Eritrea is acting in its own interest. There's a larger history between the two parties, the TPLF and the ruling party in Eritrea, that is a bit more poisonous and acrimonious. But nevertheless, Eritrea is acting on behalf of its own interest, but also in regards to supporting its obligation with this new relationship with Ethiopia, right? So that is the context, I think, in which we can think about partially why Eritrea is involved.
Claude, coming back to you once again. Now, tell me, what are the chances of talks? What are the chances of negotiations? Also, please tell me why Tigray people are asking Kenya for interfering or, to conduct the talks between the two sides. What's Kenya's interest in this conflict?
So there is one thing that I want to make a little bit more accurate. When I look at the TPLF, I don't look at them as Tigrayans, because Tigray is a large area, and there are way too many Tigrayans that are against and are also oppressed by the TPLF. So the TPLF is a political party that happens to be predominantly Tigrayans or Tigrinya. So now the prospects of a peace negotiation, this is the usual war tactics. The prospects for negotiations, I'm sure there's going to be some talk of a ceasefire and things like that. But a group like the TPLF and groups that behave in the way that the TPLF does with the type of support that they have, they never really respect the peace accords. And this is very historical as I said, in a larger context on the continent. And I don't expect it to be different. The real prospect to peace in the long run is actually justice and accountability for the atrocities that's been committed against the Ethiopian people. And remember, Tigrayans are Ethiopians. So all the atrocities that have been committed against the Ethiopian people, holding accountable the actors who are irresponsible is going to lead to lasting peace. But a peace negotiation, I think, is more a delay tactic so that they can figure out what their next moves are going to be.
Thank you very much, both of my guests, for being in my program today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard both sides, and pretty much they were on the same page with regards to this conflict. Claude gave you a larger picture of the African continent, whereas Professor has just pointed out, Professor Avash has pointed out the reasons why the Tigray people have picked up the weapons and why the state is fighting against them. I have now requested Dr. Safu Githim, who is a medical doctor, expert of African affairs, to join me from Addis Ababa, and doctor is also a supporter of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. That's what he asked me to say on screen. Dr. Safu, welcome to the show. Since we are left with very little time, I would want your very quick take on few questions that we have in our mind. Now, what, according to you, is the problem at the moment? Why do we have this fight to begin with?
We are in war. It's clear for the international community. The problem is coming from the TPLF area. Normally, they are not really to follow our ruling party and our government. So that is the problem. Secondly, what you are asking me, the Eritreans, they are our brothers also, Eritreans, before secession. Just 23 years ago, before referendum in Eritrea, all Ethiopians and Eritreans are the same. So when Eritrea on problem, the Ethiopians, they support Eritreans. When Ethiopia on problem, Eritrea will be support us. So we have the same culture, we have the same attitude. So that's why when the war is coming, they are entered. TPLF, with Tigray People Revolutionary Democratic Forces, had been lead the country, Ethiopia, which one of the biggest country in Africa. So to respect the Ethiopian constitution, he's not ready for this, or to respect the Ethiopian constitution. That is the war, by the way. So Eritreans and Ethiopians, they have the same.
But Dr. Safu, why TPLF is fighting? I mean, there are people from one region, why they are thinking to fight against an entire government that has an entire military, that has international relations with the neighboring states, why TPLF has taken such a huge risk?
In principle, TPLF had led the country for the past 30 years, you know. He led the 110 millions. Then after Abiy, our prime minister, when he's coming, he had a forward looker prime minister. So when he comes, they are not ready to follow him, and they are not respect the Ethiopian peoples. That's why the war is coming. It's a matter of power, and some criminals, they are in Tigray. That's why they are not respect the Ethiopian people and our constitution plus and the Ethiopian prime minister, because they have their own thinking, is ethnic politics. So Abiy, he dismissed this ethnic politics and he wants to forward the country.
But don't you believe that the government have not been able to bring peace during last 2 years? Has it not been a catastrophic failure on part of the government?
The reason TPLF, you know, he's not cooperative to bring peace. The Ethiopian government currently, the ruling prosperity, had a big willing to make a peace. But the TPLF had done many things, especially he massacred our military through in the world. It's the first time, by the way, he massacred. You know, before 20 years ago, Ethiopia and Eritrea, they are on war. At that time, our military was built highly. So, you know, he protect the Tigrayans people for the past 20 years. So for the political benefit, they massacred our militaries highly. That's why the war was the cause of the war. So for the past 2 years, it's yes, you are right, we are in war, but the cause is from TPLF. TPLF still is not cooperative with the Ethiopian government, not respect also the Ethiopians. So this is Abiy's strategy must be respect the Ethiopian people from any enemy. So they are rebels, you know. They are lead the Ethiopians for the past 30 years. Finally, they gone to and state like a state mind, and finally they are oppositions party. Finally, and finally they are guerrilla fighters. You know, the matter of mentality. Sorry for the cough. So this is the reason. Still 2 years, the war is continued, but our government had ready for peace.
But Dr. Sefu, has all the options of negotiations failed? Is war the only way out of the crisis that we have in hand today?
The negotiation is important. You know, from war, who is the winner? From war, we didn't get any benefit, for example. Even the international community, they must be support the right way. You know, sometimes some Western countries, they support the rebels group. This is for Africans especially, it is very challenging. So they must be respect the peoples and also the ruling, especially who is elected eligibly, legally. So it must be respected. You know, sometimes some West Africans, West Africa, the Westerns, they want to make a war. That is a bad thing. You know, why TPLF is going to the war, for example? The Western or the UN must be respect the legitimate government, already was elected and legal. So, you know, sometimes the war 2 years, of course, the government, he needs negotiation until now. Even we were on war, still we were in war. On wartime, also our government highly ready for peace. So the Western, the UN, even they must be support this system. Otherwise, if we are encouraging the terrorism group, it is very tough. We had a lot of examples. Some country was distracted, already separated. For example, it is a good example of Syria. Example of Libya. You know, if you encourage informal group, it's very tough. It's very tough. But of course, still we are in war. Our peoples already, we are the same culture. We have the same mind. So our peoples, they need peace. Even the Tigrayans, when you come to, they are my brothers. We have sisters. So still we need the negotiation properly for 2 years. Of course, we are in war. But sometimes some rebels group, especially TPLF, was it is a terrorist group by Ethiopian parliament rules. So why the UN, they are respected them. Sometimes they need negotiation. Of course, negotiation will continue. Will continue. Will continue.
And lastly, Dr. Saifu, why do you believe Kenya has been called to sort out the problem? What is Kenya's interest in this entire picture?
Yeah, we will appreciate the Kenyan movement normally to bring peace in the northern part of Ethiopia. But until the TPLF said it's not cooperative. So the Kenya, they did well. Still, the former president also has tried to make peace, but TPLF is not agree because TPLF is a rebels normally. Formally, my government is very eager for peace. That's why he will deal and will be negotiate with TPLF. So the Kenyans, they did great things. Still now, they are neighbors for my country. Not only Kenya, all the East African neighbors country for Ethiopia, they want calm peace in Ethiopia. So the Nairobi government had made a lot of things. He has a responsibility because if Ethiopia is in war, in Nairobi, there is no any peace, by the way. Even in the Horn of Africa, it will be a problem. If Ethiopia disturbed, for Africans also is a big problem. So they tried a lot of things. They are our brothers, Nairobian brothers. All are Kenyans, Ethiopians. They have the same mind mentality. We have the same continent. So still, the Ethiopians' problem, it is the same as Nairobi. It will be the same. So of course, they tried a lot of things. They are continuing still now. So we will hear them. If there is good way for peace, our government is ready.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saifu, for being a guest in our program. Ladies and gentlemen, the problems in Africa are exacerbating and repetitive in nature. As long as the people are not educated, the institution of democracy are not maintained, the problems will keep chasing the poor people of Africa. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.